So before we proceed with the interview, I just wanted to say where we are, because we're actually outside of where David's living, inside Gyan Sarovar complex, which is in Mount Abu, Rajasthan. So David's based here as the resident artist, musician, looks after the art department here. So that's another whole kind of story of a journey, but just so you can see where we are. And in a few hours there's going to be an eclipse, which we probably won't see because it's quite a cloudy day.
Yes, it's very overcast and...
Yeah, so it's sort of pre-monsoon, early monsoon days in June 2020. So back to Kimberley, which was 1980, I don't think we said which
1982
year.
I was there.
1982. And you were just talking about how you had built this house that you then lived in for a year on your own, well, with the camp, but you said you were quite independent.
Yes, I built, where I'd built was quite away from the main camp. I was in another valley. I could see the top roof of the main camp, but it was where I'd built as well, it was very, very difficult to get to, because you had to climb over these rocks and this and that, and I was a bit like a mountain goat when I was living there, because I literally had to climb up the rock face, and the entrance of the house was through the floor. The main doorway you had to climb up, so like a tree house, you come up through the floor and into the place, because it was off the side of the cliff. So that's how you got into the place.
Well, you were young and very
24 years old then.
And did you feel quite safe in your...
Well, I did. I mean, I didn't have fear of living there alone. I mean, and I went through the, I guess sort of with the nature and the wildlife. I mean, you learnt whatever come in the house, whatever crawled on you, you just waited for it to crawl off. You just learnt in that sort of environment that I felt anyway that was a natural progression to live with all the other animals that were in that area. The rock wallabies had come down the rocks at night around the house, and then there was a marsupial cat that used to come in and look around the fireplace when I'd cook any little bits of food. And then there was kangaroo rats that I used to play with. I guess I wasn't that nice to them a lot of the time, because they'd run across the top of the roof of the house, and I'd see the indentation and the tarpaulin on the roof, and I'd go underneath and go, tung, and then I'd listen to see where they come down, because it was about a 20-foot drop from where, because I was off the side of the cliff, you see.
Oh my God,
and
they might go flying off the cliff.
Yeah, they'd go flying off the cliff, but one day bit me through the mosquito net one time, on the toes, through the mosquito net. So I had this relationship with the kangaroo rats, which was...
you were telling me once about that little... What was it?
The marsupial cat.
Yeah, the one that you were feeding. So what was his destiny?
Well, no, I never fed. I mean, there's an animal there called the quoll, and they're I guess commonly known as a marsupial cat, but they don't look like a cat as a domestic cat we know of. They're more of a bit like possum face and a short stumpy tail, and a bit sort of like coloured spots on their back. Oh, yeah. But the hermit, or this X, he was telling me his story. He had one that he used to feed every night when he'd cook. It'd come into his place and it'd wait there for him to give food. Like any animal, if you keep feeding it, it will come at the same time. And of course, but he said this becomes so territorial that in the end he couldn't even get his food out of the saucepan without this marsupial cat growling at him, like, this is my food, And of course, the thing what happens too in this type of environment, your whole world is with the nature, all the reactions, the things that come around, the things that may bite you or this all have some significance, because you're in this space where all your interactions are with the nature, and they all have some...
It's mirroring.
It's like your karmic sort of thing with the nature, and all that is all happening in that world, So when he told me this story, I thought, there's no way I'm going to feed any of this
carry on. It's okay.
Yeah, there's no way in the world I'm going to feed any of this if one of them comes in near the camp.
Yeah.
Well, of course, one did come in, and I knew one was coming around at night. I sometimes would spot it, very glimpse of it, but I never ever. It used to come and get what food I had around the camp, you know, because if you had some rice and you spilt a little bit somewhere, they would come around and sniff around for anything, you know. But when this animal started coming around, of course, then what happened? A big python would come under the house at night, because when I climb up the rocks to get into the house, of course, climbing up the rocks to get into the floor, some of the rocks which come up to the house is big rocks, and this python would sit on this big rock, and it was waiting for this marsupial cat. So it waited, I think, for at least 2 or 3 months before it caught this marsupial cat. And of course, one night I heard this big scream, and then I jumped out of bed and I had the torch and I shine under the house, and of course there was this python wrapped around this marsupial cat, you know. And of course that was the last of the cat and the last till I saw the python. But it was very patient. And you know, I used to come up the house right on dusk where you could just have enough light to see. And of course the python would be, you know, curled up on this rock, you know. So it was waiting every night. And it never moved when I come up the house. It just
didn't bother you.
But you know, it was interesting because I also had the experience of big python come in the house, dropped out of the tree. Actually, I was built under this banyan tree. I didn't know banyan trees were in Australia, but at the time, I remember when I come to India, the first time I saw the banyan tree with all the roots that grow out, all this, it was where I'd built was all this banyan tree, and all the roots were growing down the rock, you know. It was a beautiful setting, picturesque. But it was under this banyan tree, and of course the different birds that used to come there. But one of the things was like, when I built the house, I was very particular where whatever I pulled out of the forest and wherever I moved, I tried not to disturb any of the other area, you know. It was like a feeling of. And when I got my seat, where I had a seat for the place, I remember going down amongst all this beautiful area with these coloured granite stones, and I picked up this granite rock, and it split in two. And the top part of the rock was this beautiful turquoisey green coloured granite rock, and when I picked it up and went to take it away, I couldn't take it because all the other rocks were the similar colour, and when I took this top part of the rock, underneath was a brownish colour of the underneath part, and it looked like a feeling that the area I didn't want to, so I took the bottom part of the rock and put the top part of the rock where position, and so it didn't look like there was anything disturbed, you know. So it was that sort of connection with the nature that I didn't want to take any more than what I needed. That was a real feeling there, and that was I guess going back the previous year till I went up there in 1981, I was actually called up for an Aboriginal initiation in a town called Port Hedland, and I had this experience again of this like bodiless soul come into me, which really scared me. I didn't know what was going on, but the next morning I shared this story with this Aboriginal girl, which was my friend's partner, and she associated the experience with what she saw in the morning. The back of the house is a goanna at the back doorstep, and a goanna is a spirit, and the time of year when the tribal elders would send out spirits to round up the young boys for initiation into their spiritual lore. So she said, "You've been called up for initiation." And of course I thought, well, I'm not Aboriginal, but
reminds me of Carlos Castaneda a bit, and the young, you know, the initiations and the looking for the kind of signals from the creatures that take on the spirit of that.
Yeah, so I was really, that was something that was really scary at the time. I mean, I was like paralyzed and I couldn't move at the time, this experience, and I sat up and I was asking, who is this, you know, like, what do you want? And then I lied down again, and the same energy come into me, and it was like I sat up. But the next day when she told me this, I remember that next year I I didn't think too much about it, you know, it was just experience. But then that 1982, when I was invited to this place, being a sacred site of the Aboriginal people, I connected with that story later. And then I thought, okay, part of the initiation in the Aboriginal people are to go out into the bush like that and live in the bush, in the wild, and how you experience that, because everyone will experience that differently. You know, for me it was like a paradise, and it was, for me, I discovered initially the thing of just being, because being was like I'd always been doing. I mean, I worked as a job as a carpenter, apprenticeship, and my work times were like 4 to 7 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So that was all I knew of a work for money type situation. This place was like all of that dropped away. You didn't have any clock time, no calendar, no reference to, you know, the only reference was the heat of the day, the shadows of the side of the cliff. In the afternoon you'd do things in the shadow, and in the morning, in the shadow in the morning, and in the middle of the day you kept out of the sun because it was just too hot. And then of course not wearing clothes. But living with the nature and the animals, I found that fascinating, because it's like you found that I was like another animal in this environment, and I was fitting in with these other animals which were already living there, and how you adjusted to that and what come in. If something crawled on you, you waited for it to crawl off and you didn't react, and it was this like every creature there had its own timing in that 24-hour cycle, and you got to know that, you observed that.
So you never got bored and lonely by the sound of it?
No, I mean I had two different experiences there, but no, it was never boring. I mean, I discovered how to make things out of shells, and then I made little bridges across the spring out of trees, and like handrails and little log sort of like bridges, because I had my toolkit was apart from the bow saw, the chisel and the hammer, I had a Bowie knife, a hunting knife, so I took all the bark off the trees with that and carved things. And then I started painting. I discovered painting. I mean, the hermit, X and X, he had some little tins of coloured enamel paint, and I found this little piece of plywood, and I got inspired, and I first painted this head, and it had this third eye with this sort of like line coming out of it. That was the first one, and then the second picture I painted was this golden temple, which was like a...
So that was the first art you ever...
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Because I never did art before that. It was like...
Yeah.
And then the amazing part happened was, one of the things which I first discovered there was like this thing of being. Yeah, I started to share that, because the being part to me was like, I think that was the first place I really felt it was okay just to be. If I wanted to sit by the spring all day, if I wanted to sleep all day, if I wanted whatever, there was no rules of anything. It was just like this discovering this space of being. And that was like a wonder, because it's like I never had that experience where I was...
Not many human beings would have had that.
Yeah, I was uninfluenced by anything outside except my own, you could say, my own traits, or, idiosyncrasies, or your own sanskaras. In the Hindi word, sanskaras means your own character. But that was the first thing I realized, how much I was influenced by other people as well before that, because until I got to that place where it was completely just the nature and just like this, like wonderland, you could almost say, like this, being in a new place and discovering this, and then building their own place and living like that. And I went through a cyclone there, which the lightning was hitting the tops of the cliff, and big boulders were getting blown off into the down, rolling down the cliff, and you're also on the side of the cliff, and you don't know whether you're next as well, you're like, and it was like, I guess the adrenaline and the feelings of being so vulnerable in this intensity of the environment and the nature. But then you also come into this, where sometimes people share when they're in a crisis situation or emergency, where the adrenaline and that, and you have this super strength which you just do things you can never do in a normal so-called state of consciousness. And I remember going through this cyclone like that, where I was just like, you're on this a whole nother planet, you know, and then all the spring become like rapids and waterfalls, and then all the nature, all the sounds of the frogs and everything become all amplified, because they all had to go louder to hear each other because of the running water was like rapids, you know. So all this thing changed and it took out huge amounts of soil and big trees and out into the ocean, you know, because of the cyclone and the rains.
Did you take photos of that?
Funny enough, I took beautiful photos. I had an underwater camera there. So I had that specially because you could be in anywhere and have you didn't have to worry about the camera and film getting spoiled. But when I got back to the town after 1 year spending there, and I got these developed, the film, beautiful photos, but the Aboriginal people knew that I'd been here, and they come into my camp and they took every photo I'd taken.
So they knew because you got them developed in town, do you think? Or
no, they knew I was living up in this place, which is a sacred site, and of course a sacred site means no photos. And they were very, very, I mean, the Aboriginal people, I didn't have a lot to do with them, like as far as personal contact, but they knew I was living there, and they were in where I come back to this town of Broome outside the town. They were further, another 60, 80 miles up the top of that gulf was a peninsula and then an island, and that was the closest point to that Cone Bay. But they knew, and they come in and they took every photo. So I had no photo reference of any. I had beautiful photos of the house, but fortunately for me, 2 years later after that, somebody had gone up there and they'd found the place where I'd built, and they took 2 or 3 photos, and I've got those photos. So that's my reference. Right. Those ones are there, you know. Yeah, so
yeah. I'll put those photos if I haven't.
So yeah. I do have, and you know, it's like and going back to this picture, I painted this picture of this golden temple, and it had 5 doorways in the bottom of this golden temple. It was a bit like shaped like the Taj Mahal. And I was influenced by this X and X, because he was very, very disciplined, as you can imagine. To live out in this place, you take your food supplies, which would have to last 4 months or something, and he'd ration out all his food, and he was, what I remember, he was so disciplined with his food. He ate like a sparrow, you know, like, and he was really, he'd have so much of this every few days or whatever, he'd ration. And I was completely out of control, you know. So all the tasty things I bought, you know, and of course, you know, used to smoke a bit of the, you know.
Munchies.
Yeah, and it's sort of, and, but I was, you know, like it is, you usually get inspired by somebody else's dana or their discipline, and I was admiring that in this X and X, and of course I wanted to be like that. I wanted to be disciplined, but I wasn't. So when I'd painted this picture, these 5 doorways represented the 5 senses, and I put these 5 rainbow colors coming to this eye, which was in space. It was like all space background, night sky with stars and planets, and this golden temple with these 5 archways with 5 rainbow colors coming to this eye in space. With the bottom was a cone as well, because Cone Bay was like, and when the amazing part about it, when I'd put this painting on the handrail just 2 meters in front of me, 3 meters in front of me, there was a very clear picture of somebody sitting in the middle of the temple. But I didn't paint that, I only painted a temple, but I could see a very clear photograph image of somebody sitting in the middle of the temple, white hair, white moustache, sitting like in a half lotus position. And I thought, who is this person? And just to be in the painting like that, which I didn't paint, I only painted the temple, but you know, it's like if you painted a wall with one color and then painted another color over it, and you can still see through the first color, but it was a very clear image of somebody sitting in meditation. And just before that, I had my first read of anything from the East, which was this book, Autobiography of a Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda. And I had many stories in there of these saints and sages in India which had different occult powers and city powers. They climbed up ropes and disappeared in the air, and some didn't eat, and it had a lot of black and white photographs in it. Well, I thought maybe, because I was so inspired by this book, that maybe this person in a temple is one of these people in So I went down to the hermits camp, got the book again, got up to my place and looked at this picture and was looking through the photos to see if any were similar to this, but of course they weren't. But the thing which happened then, from that moment onwards, every time I had even one mouthful more of something to eat than what I needed, what the body needed, I would get some sort of pinprick or something would happen where it was like almost I was getting taught, okay, if you, and the feeling was very loveful feeling as well, like it was like I was in tears of like joy of this. It was just like a feeling that if I surrendered to this truth which I thought was in silence, because I had this big thing with silence there, like it was so silent there, but surrendered to this silence, but if I did that, everything I needed would be provided, like this, like guarantee. And this was to do with the food as well, like if I took just what I need, I'd always have enough type of that experience. So this went on for some weeks, and I thought, wow, and it was like, and so that was my journey into that, of thinking, okay, I knew from that point there was some intelligence or some being or something that was guiding me. I didn't know what, but I felt there was some guidance, and it was a feeling if I surrendered to this silence, whatever I need would be provided, that thing. It wasn't long after that experience that I remember it was on a full moon, and you know, as you can imagine, in this place where it's all rock, all the white rocks glow up in the moonlight, you know, like, so on the other side of this valley, the cliffs and all that, there's all these rocks. Anyway, the moon was like overhead, and I could see the moon rays of the moonlight, or the light shining through the top of the banyan tree coming down to where I was, and I'd pulled back the roof of the house so I could see the moon, you know. And of course you imagine in this, all of the moonlight, the full moon, everything's lit up and it's so clear, you know, because it's so far away from, and anyway, it was like I was staring at these rocks on the other side of the cliff, and then one rock was like, it was lit up like one of these salt rocks, you know, lit up, glowing from inside, and I was staring at it, and I thought, wow, there's like the one rock out of all these rocks was like glowing. And as I was staring at it for a length of time, I could just see the vision of the moon above my head, and it was like this feeling of the light from the moon coming down, and this rock, glowing rock, and the light coming from that, and it met right in the middle of my forehead, and I had this experience of myself as like a being of light, or a feeling of being eternal. And anyway, I was so inspired by this, like I was like all these things of like being immortal, and so the next day, I spent all night awake. Next day I climbed up this cliff face, which was quite steep, and I got to this rock. Yeah. And when I got to it, I realized what had happened, because it was a flat face rock, and it must have been 45-degree angle to where I was the other side, and it was just reflecting like a mirror of the moonlight to where I was. Wow. And so I painted it like this red, big red circle. I had these little paints left, so I painted this red dot and this blue band around it, and that become I used to sit on the other side of the valley and then to stare at this rock, and then having these thoughts of myself as light, as this. And so that was my
what a preparation for the next chapter of your life.
Yeah.
And how did you end up deciding to actually leave? Like, how long did you stay? You said that you went back to Broome, but did you go back again?
I had 2 trips up to Cone Bay, in that time. And after this time it was like a feeling this was great, but I felt this is great, but to be amongst people and have this same sort of awareness or consciousness must be a higher aim. Because it was wonderful there. I mean, I love the nature, the solitude and all this, but it was really in the middle of nowhere, you know, like there was nothing else there. So it was like a feeling I'd had that time for that experience.
Your initiation was over.
Yeah, and so then it was like I got back to Derby, and I actually, interesting enough, because when I went back, actually I said to my parents at that point that I'd be back at a Christmas time. And of course, Christmas time come around and there was no boat going back. The other two people there, no one was going. And they said, well, you take your boat, because I bought up a dinghy myself, a little 3-metre dinghy. And they said, you can take your dinghy back. Well, you know, 2 days with a big boat. This little dinghy I had did, I don't know, it was like incredibly slow, and then I would have to go right around the whole bay, which would take at least 4 days.
The fire is like
well, I was scared stiff of doing that. I said, no way, I didn't, because I didn't know the way, you know.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's all right just saying, yeah, okay, this, but you know, when you first trip out there, go back, you're going past all these islands, you don't know what's mainland, what's islands, and you know, if you're lost there, you're lost, you know, like you. So there was a trawler that came past, and they were going up the coast hunting for dugong and turtle. They had 2 Aboriginal people on board. They were legal for them to hunt the dugong and turtle. And they said, well, if you want to, you can come back with us, but we're going up another 4 days up the coast. We're maybe not coming past here again, Cone Bay, so if you want to lift back to the town, you have to come now. So I ended up going on this trawler for 4 days up the coast. They were hunting dugong, and they were like pirates as well. They raided, there's 2 iron ore mining islands, and they raided their water camp storage on one island, you know, and then I remember he sort of, he was saying to me, you know, they were hunting this dugong, and they hunted, I think, 3 dugong they caught. And then they...
Dugong are like...
Dugong is like
dolphins?
the sea cow. They got like a snout.
Yeah, that's what I was imagining.
Yeah, snout, and they feed off the reef and all that, and they got like a whale's tail.
Are they protected now? Or?
Well, they are protected, but the indigenous people, they can hunt them because that's their traditional food.
Yeah.
So that's why they had 2 Aboriginal on this trawler, because they were legal to hunt them. So they hunted 3 of those, and it was like a shock for me to get onto this trawler, because I'd been in such a peaceful space and these experiences, and then to get onto this boat, and the people on the boat were in another headspace. They were just hunting and wanted to hunt everything that was come along, and then I was like totally detached from that. But then there was a feeling also, I'm on the boat, I had to do my fair share of the work, something while I was on there for the ride at least. So I ended up helping them with this and this and this, but it was like, and then one time, you know, because up there, the big tides, we went up this creek, and the mud flats were like angled down like this, and the captain said, listen, we're going up in the dinghy. If a crocodile comes down at us, sliding down on its belly, you know, down the mud flat, it will go straight into the boat, because the boat is lower than the mud, you know, in the water, the shape of the thing. So he was saying to me what to do if that happens. If you get on the mud flats, you don't run in a straight line, you zigzag, you know, because the crocodile can't change direction like that. They go in one direction, you know. So I thought, great. And then he had a big piece of pine wood in the boat, a stick. If one comes in you put that in its mouth, so it grabs it, and
it can't let go that easily.
So I thought, great, you know. So I was thinking, my God. Anyway, so luckily we didn't get attacked by a crocodile, but at night time there was at least 6-7 crocodiles around the trawler at night, just sitting in the water with their mouth open, you know, waiting for something to fall in, you know. So, and then one of the trips too, they went ashore, and then I heard this big bang. They'd fired the rifle, and then the captain come back with the back leg of a cow. So, you know, he just shot a cow and just thought, okay, we want something for dinner, so he brought back the back leg of a cow, you know. So it was like...
So that was the end of your trip?
No, well, we come back and we got caught in a cyclone coming back as well, so we almost lost the whole trawler, everything. I had a lot of my first classical guitar got all smashed up. All the luggage on the trawler was moving around and all got squashed in one corner and broke that, and so that was quite, you know, like exciting trip back. But then, you know, I got back to town, and funny enough, because, you know, why I went back was like I had this thing I'd said to my parents,
Yeah.
and I thought they were expecting me to be back because I'd said that, and of course I got back, and that was on my mind of this. And when I got back, of course, those days no cell phones or anything. You had to go to the phone thing and make put in the money and make the phone call. And they said, no, we're not expecting you back. So it was like a lesson of attachment and just how the thoughts created this, you know. I created this whole thing of thinking they were expecting me because I'd said that, naturally. But then it was like a lesson too of... So that pulled me out of the place, and then I went back to the place of Port in Broome, and then... and that's another journey again. And when I got back to Broome, then I was not interested in carpentry. I was interested in painting. I got very inspired to paint. And so my friend, one of my good friends in Broome, had gone out to a property outside of Broome, a place called Coconut Well, and he'd built a mud place on this property, and he did some work on this property. And he said to me, the woman who owns the property wants a sun deck built on her log cabin. You could get that job if you want. So I got that job, and after I built this sun deck on top of this log cabin, she said, if you want to build a place on the property anywhere, you're welcome, as a payment, you know. So I got all these second-hand materials, and I built this little 3 metre by 4 metre hut, and so then I started painting from that place. I remember sent down to Perth, and I got a little compressor and an airbrush and a book. And then I used to pump up the old fire hydrant cylinder with air to use as an airbrush. And then I started painting like that. And I started painting my experience of that 1 year in Kimberley.
Wow. And do you have any paintings from
I have some samples of that, yeah. I actually, and funny enough, every picture I had to put this image of light in it, this 8-pointed star, because I experienced that then myself as light and this 8-pointed star. So it was probably about a year after I got back, a year and a half after, and then the local town has a big festival every July, August in a full moon for the Shinju Mashuri, which is Festival of the Pearl. They have a festival of this pearl. So the whole town goes from like 4,000 people, 5,000 people up to 25,000 people over 2-3 weeks. A big festival with games on the beach and planes, jets fly overhead, you know, there's a whole big show. And they would ask the local artists to put in pictures for an exhibition, like in the fair. So they asked me, you can put in 5, 6, 7, 8 pictures if you want. So right at that time, one person who was used to visit that town every year at the festival time, come on the property where I was living, and saw the pictures I was painting, and I saw this image of light, and he said, you know what you're painting? And I said to him, I shared the experience, I had the experience of this image of light. And he said, yeah, this is a picture of soul. And this, yeah. And I started sharing my experience. He said, this picture, he said, you must put this in this exhibition, this one. So I put in that one and about 6 others, and that one won first prize for the watercolour. So I got like $300 plus or something. Those days was good. And I got introduced to...
So he was the person who then introduced you to the meditation.
Yeah.
Which is another video.
Probably another video, yes.
I think in another location we can do your meditation journey. I think that would be a nice another chapter.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, David. That was really, really good. I think people will enjoy that a lot.
Good, thank you.